great connection, as we know. We are more connected to each other than we've ever been. We're more able to reach out and connect with someone anywhere in the world than we've ever been. You would think, by all accounts, we should be the least lonely people that have ever lived on this planet. And yet, by all accounts, we appear to be the most lonely people. Loneliness is one of the great diseases or malaises of our time. We know that people suffer from loneliness pretty much as a spiritual illness. It's this lack of connection, despite the technology which connects us. There continues to be this feeling of a lack of connection with others. It's a little bit like the more we are connected, the less we connect. Of course, there are all sorts of practical reasons why people have suffered from loneliness. And in the last 2 years, nothing has brought that more to our attention, more to the fore, than, of course, lockdown, where people have literally found themselves isolated and yet connected. What makes us lonely, and is that the same as being alone? Loneliness, psychologists tell us, is really caused by a variety of different factors which end up giving us some kind of disconnectedness or disorientation with respect to our world, our circumstances that we find ourselves in. So it might be caused by different things. For example, social anxiety. Some people are uncomfortable with crowds or with lots of people for a variety of possible reasons. But that social anxiety makes them withdraw themselves either physically or emotionally from the world of people around them. Then you get people who've actually experienced trauma at someone else's hands that makes them somewhat shy of people. So, for example, a child who's abused by a powerful male figure might grow up to be very wary of males, just to use a simplistic example. That's very possible and real. So trauma can also be the cause of why we kind of pull back from the world. Possibly a much more common example of why is something like low self-esteem. So many people suffer from low self-esteem for so many different reasons, very often because of the incomplete or problematical connections or disconnections with the people and the world around them. But whatever it may be, a lot of us are not sure of ourselves. A lot of us are insecure and uncertain of how we are received by others. We've got all sorts of ideas in our heads about that, and that causes a lack of self-esteem, which causes us to pull back from the world around us, as does something like the simple lack of self-assertion. A lot of people are not assertive, and so they find themselves feeling disconnected even when they are in a group environment, because they go silent or they feel sometimes cut off or shut off or something like that that makes them not really sure of what they should say, so they should rather say nothing. Some people say that really ultimately what causes loneliness is a kind of a poor self-awareness. Many people are unaware of and therefore afraid of their own minds. So they ignore their own thoughts, stay disconnected from themselves, and so loneliness is then defined as a disconnection from oneself. Certainly there are people who have lots of defenses against their own thoughts, but there are all sorts of things such as worries and concerns and very regular stuff, as well as memories and difficult circumstances and grief and fear and all of these things which we have mechanisms to protect us from having to think about that all the time. And unfortunately, some of that is disconnection, or an alternative version of that can be distraction. People who distract themselves with lots of activities and even lots of people so that they don't have to think too much also often feel lonely. It's almost like something inside is actually thinking or saying, there's still a problem here. You can have all the people around you and all the activities in the world, and yet you still feel lonely. But loneliness is not only about people who've got some kind of a problem, some kind of a social or psychological problem. Loneliness is something we all experience, and we all experience just in our everyday, ordinary kind of lives, without necessarily defending ourselves from something or blocking ourselves from something. Is it a malaise of the modern person, of any person? What is the loneliness we experience, and what is the solution to it? And this is why I thought, let's consult some of our favorite teachers. Well-known author Paulo Coelho, author of The Alchemist, and author of a number of other books, has spoken and written on the subject of loneliness, and this is what he says. Even though I am surrounded by loved ones who care about me and want only the best, it's possible they try to help only because they feel the same thing, loneliness. And why, in a gesture of solidarity, you'll find the phrase, I am useful, even if alone, carved in stone. Though the brain says all is well, the soul is lost, confused, doesn't know why life is being unfair to it. But we still wake up in the morning, take care of our children, our husband, our lover, our boss, our employees, our students, those dozens of people who make ordinary life and an ordinary day come to life. And we often have a smile on our face and a word of encouragement, because no one can explain their loneliness to others, especially when we're always in good company. But this loneliness exists, and it eats away at the best parts of us, because we must use all of our energy to appear happy, even though we will never be able to deceive ourselves. But we insist every morning on showing only the rose that blooms, and keep the thorny stem that hurts us and makes us bleed hidden within. Even knowing that everyone at some point has felt completely and utterly alone, it is humiliating to say, I am lonely, I need company. Very powerful thoughts from an extremely insightful writer. And I'm sure most of us recognize ourselves somewhere in that description, and recognize that experience in our lives, maintaining a happy face while feeling lonely inside. And even though we know that everyone has that experience, we still feel shame because of it. Shame is a whole story of its own. And when talking earlier about the causes of loneliness, it's worth remembering that lots of those inner negative feelings cause loneliness, and then the loneliness as an inner negative feeling causes shame, and you have a vicious circle. The shame then causes us to feel isolation, causes us to pull back and hide our real selves, and despite being in happy company with everyone else, we are disconnected and isolated and lonely even when surrounded by others. So it's worth examining our sense of shame that arises out of loneliness, and remembering everyone else here has experienced this before. Doesn't mean we're going to say something about it, but it's worth remembering Coelho's other words, where he says elsewhere, loneliness, when accepted, becomes a gift that will lead us to find a purpose in life. A little bit later on, we'll see with some other teachers what he might be referring to. Some years ago, Eckhart Tolle hit the scene, and writing about his famous book, The Power of Now, writing about the importance of living in the present. Tolle has also spoken on the subject of loneliness, and he says, there have never been more lonely people than now. Loneliness perhaps is a relatively recent phenomenon for humanity. In the past, one's identity was very tribal. And if you were expelled from the tribe, you would die. Not just physical, psychologically you would die. And then later on, when there were no tribes, but social groups, those lonely outsiders very often were those through whom breakthroughs came into this world, because they were forced to go deeper. Those who didn't fit in for one reason or another, those who felt so lonely, they were forced deeper into the vertical dimension rather than seeking some kind of solution on the horizontal dimension, more relationships or whatever. So there's great opportunity in loneliness. And through acceptance, one can say loneliness transforms into solitude. Solitude means being alone. And it's quite beautiful being alone. Some very significant thoughts there. On the one hand, that it is the lonely forced to dig deeper into themselves who provide us all with breakthroughs, who even provide themselves with breakthroughs. On the other hand, there's something else that he talks about as well. He talks about solitude, being alone, and he calls that beautiful. Clearly, being alone, aloneness, is not the same as loneliness. We'll find more on that as we go as well. So in that then, essentially lies an instruction to us, a suggestion to us, that says you must use the loneliness to explore vertically. Don't seek out relationships as a solution to loneliness, but go deeper into yourself and find where you can be alone. Almost like saying, transform loneliness into aloneness. So we'll see what it is about aloneness that makes it so special. But a well-known Tibetan teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, explains to us what loneliness really is and why it needs that solution. He says, loneliness is the ill-being of our time. We feel very lonely. Even if we are surrounded by many people, we are lonely together. And there is a vacuum inside of us, and we do not feel comfortable with that kind of vacuum. So we try and fill it up by connecting with other people. We believe that when we connect with other people, that feeling of loneliness will disappear. And technology supplies us with a lot of devices in order to connect. Stay connected. We always stay connected, but we continue to feel lonely. We use technology to try and dissipate that feeling of loneliness, but we have not succeeded. In our daily life, we are disconnected with ourselves. We walk, but we do not know that we are walking. We are there, but we do not know that we are there. We are alive, but we do not know that we are alive. We are losing ourselves. We are not ourselves. Because how can you connect with another person when you cannot connect with yourself? So that process of the vertical dimension, the vertical self-exploration that Eckhart Tolle described, is not just a feeling, a process of discovering the gift of loneliness, that is, discovering aloneness, but it is also discovering yourself. And you'll remember psychologists define loneliness as potentially related to this avoidance of oneself and avoidance of one's issue. And here's Han saying that it is the self that we need to connect with, and then we will never feel lonely. We don't need other people. We only need what it is that we discover at the end of that vertical exploration. And that is expressed by the very well-known teacher Deepak Chopra. And Chopra addresses that very issue of finding the self within and healing loneliness. He says healing loneliness requires more than simply seeking out company. As you've probably experienced, you can feel lonely in the middle of a crowd or at a holiday party or with a group of caring friends. The root of loneliness isn't the absence of other people, but an inner absence. You don't have a centered awareness of your true self. Your true self is your spirit, which is infinite and eternal. Its qualities include love, compassion, equanimity, joy, creativity, intuition, pure potentiality, and bliss. When you are established in the awareness of your true self, you feel lovable and connected, whether you're in a packed stadium or spending a quiet afternoon by yourself. At the most basic level, the company you enjoy the most is your own. Loneliness, on the other hand, is the condition of feeling negative about your own company, and therefore requiring other people to fill that inner lack. Feeling an inner lack is almost universal. It's a result of a restricted state of awareness that is constricted, unable to look beyond rigid boundaries. The more you try and defend those boundaries, the more fearful and insecure you become. Loneliness is only one symptom. When your awareness is constricted, it's easy to get lost in the drama of the ego mind, that limited aspect of ourselves which feels separate. In a misguided attempt to feel secure, the ego mind relies on reinforcement from other people to feel lovable, never realizing that love is our essential nature. This struggle is a crucial cause of loneliness and pain. And that's why it is said the ego craves company while the spirit wants to connect in solitude. So loneliness is a result of the ego wanting some kind of reinforcement. Krishnamurti tackles the subject of loneliness and helps us find that the answer lies in aloneness. Loneliness and aloneness are not the same. Aloneness is the solitude that we seek. Loneliness is the suffering that we have from our ego, our identity self, not being recognized or not feeling strong. But the ego self is not the real self. Krishnamurti says, you have associated certain words with this feeling that comes over you. Words like loneliness, isolation, fear, being cut off. You must not let these words interfere with your examination of the feeling they have come to represent. You will find that the feeling itself isn't frightening, but only what you think about the feeling. It's the mind, thought, that brings fear to the feeling. Remember the great Stoic Epictetus says, what upsets people is not things themselves, but their judgments of those things. So it starts off with, I'm feeling lonely. And it turns into, oh my God, it's terrible, I'm lonely, I'm a victim, I'm sad. And it turns into all these associations and meanings we give to the word. And that's what Epictetus and Krishnamurti are warning us against. So Krishnamurti says, what is loneliness? Most of us are lonely. Out of that loneliness, we want companionship. We escape from loneliness through every form of entertainment, We escape in so many ways, but like a deep disease that must be cured, it's always there. We get very hurt, not only about little things, but deeply hurt in not being able to fulfill, not being able to achieve, not being able to become something. We get deeply hurt, and that hurt affects our actions. You cannot escape from distorting action if you are hurt. That is, as long as you have an image about yourself, you're going to be hurt, inevitably. And when there is hurt, action will be destructive, will bring about conflict. Is it possible to be aware of this loneliness and not escape from it, but remain with it? Not take a drink, not pick up a book, not rush off to some form of entertainment, but to completely, without any movement of thought, remain with that feeling of utter isolation? Then you will see, if you do that, that feeling of isolation disappears completely. Because it is thought that creates the sense of isolation. And why do human beings go through this loneliness? Ask yourself. It must exist because of your actions. He says, your daily actions are self-centered. Your daily thoughts and activities are concerned with yourself. You may be a social worker and give your life to that, but the me is still going on. Only you have identified yourself with something else. So, as long as there is self-centered activity, there must be loneliness. That kind of sums it all up. We're so wrapped up in ourselves. It's all about ourselves. No wonder we feel lonely all the time. Because how do we feed that? If the ego ever wanted feeding, that describes why. But we seek to be alone, not lonely, says Krishnamurti. But it is the ego that is alone. It is the ego that seeks all that reinforcement. You know, the idea that we are alone, that we are lonely, comes from the idea that we're separated from everything. And, I mean, is a fish separated from the water that it's in? Not really. Are we separated from the air and from other people? Not really. We can't really be separate. But boundaries that seem solid are not solid. We're all interconnected. We breathe the same air. Our skin seems to stop over here, but it responds to the air. It gets dry, it gets moist, it is affected by pollution. It interacts. Where exactly does the skin stop and the air begin? So, we need to understand that loneliness is related to our need to connect with others. But it is aloneness that we seek. Aloneness. This aloneness, says Krishnamurti, is not aching, fearsome loneliness. It is the aloneness of being. It is uncorrupted, rich, complete. The tamarind tree has no existence other than being itself. So is this aloneness. One is alone, like the fire, like the flower, but one is not aware of its purity and its immensity. One can truly communicate only when there is aloneness. Being alone is not the outcome of denial, of self-enclosure. Aloneness is the purging of all motives, of all pursuits of desire, of all ends. Aloneness is not an end product of the mind. You cannot wish to be alone. Such a wish is merely an escape from the pain of not being able to commune. Loneliness, with its fear and ache, is isolation, the inevitable action of the self. This process of isolation, whether expansive or narrow, is productive of confusion, conflict, and sorrow. Isolation can never give birth to aloneness. Isolation must cease for aloneness to be. Aloneness is indivisible, and loneliness is separation. when we discover that we are part of everything, that the ego is false, that like the flower or the tree that stands there, doesn't question anything, it just is. When we understand that, we can be completely alone and feel that connectedness with the entire cosmos. Aloneness, to repeat Krishnamurti, aloneness is indivisible, and loneliness is separation. When we find our true self, not the ego, we are never alone, whether there are people there or not. I'll see you next week at the same time.